yang Ya,
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jelas suara saya? Ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Qala rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli, amma ba'd. Honorable Mr. Minister of Religious Affairs of Indonesia, Gus Yakut Khalil Qomas, thanks for you sparing some of your precious time to attend this event during your activity at the ministry. It is an honor to have you. Allah yujzikal khair. Honorable Vice Rector of WIN Walisongo Semarang, Honorable Dean and all faculty member in the Faculty of Dakwah and Communication in Islamic Higher Education in Indonesia, the Honorable Dean, Vice Dean of all faculties, directors, and also Vice Director and Postgraduate Program, Honorable the Head of Institution and the internal audit unit of Universitas Islam Negeri Walisongo Semarang, respectable invited speaker, Associate Professor Florian Full from Emory University. Terima kasih Mas Pul yang hadir di tengah kita. Beliau tinggal lama di WIN Walisongo Semarang. The second, Professor Robert Hefner from the Boston University, Chris Selby, PhD from the University of Washington, and also Dr. K.H. Zainal Abidin Bakir from Gajah Mada University. And I also honorable all of the participants, ladies and gentlemen, in this Zoom, I see many colleagues in the University of Indonesia from WIN Jakarta, from Win Bandung, Win Surabaya, Win 1 Tulungagung, Win Cirebon, YN Batu Sangkar, YN Palu, YN Lok Semawe. This is my kolega. Thanks Pak Rektor, Dr. Daniel yang hadir secara langsung di forum ini. And distinguished participant and guests, ladies and gentlemen. All praises and thanks belong to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the Almighty, the most merciful, and the most beneficent. The one granted us the health, the blessing, and opportunity to attend the international conference on moderate Islam, the promoting tolerance and harmony in the digital era, held by the Faculty of Dakwah and Communication, Universitas Islam Negeri Walisongo. Secondly, may the peace and blessing of Allah be on the last prophet and messenger, Allah Master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his companions, and also those who follow in his footsteps until the end of the time. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf Universitas Islam Negeri Walisongo Semarang, I would like to welcome you all either directly or virtually, especially for the respectable invited speaker, participants from the overseas, as well as participants from Indonesia. We welcome you with the warmest greetings. Welcome you to Universitas Islam Negeri Walisongo Semarang, our smart and green campus. Thank you for your support and enthusiasm to attend this conference. I hope this will be part of our long-term commitment to address and dedicate our work to the nation, community, and also the humankind. Respectable guests, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, we are now living in the fast-moving digital era and digital life. We face irresistible changing every minute and every day. We need to embrace those changes as challenges, keeping ourselves to adapt, move forward, and also to create innovation, including dakwah. Dakwah is the process to represent knowledge and wisdom, should be adapted to the development of digital technology. In this era of disruption, I think the characteristics of high-quality dakwah determined by many factors. Saya melihat bahwa dalam era digital hari ini, era disrupsi yang semakin canggih hari ini, karakteristik dakwah banyak, keberhasilan dakwah banyak ditentukan oleh berbagai macam faktor. Menurut saya yang pertama, we must understand, we must secure, then we are today in the global citizenship. It is important to learn to be a good citizen. Saya melihat bahwa kesadaran bahwa kita hidup di era yang global ini perlu menjadi kesadaran bersama bagi kita semuanya untuk memahami regulasi dan juga komunitas. Kadang orang tidak sadar bahwa kita hidup di dunia global yang setiap aktivitas kita bisa diakses, bisa dilihat, bisa diinterpretasi oleh semua orang dimanapun dan kapanpun, tanpa batas waktu, tanpa batas tempat. Karena itu ini kesadaran yang utama kita. The second, I think we need to have innovation and creativity. Hari ini sebagaimana disampaikan Pak Dekan, di tengah suasana global yang kian kompleks, di tengah tantangan pandemi yang belum berakhir, inovasi dan kreativitas layak untuk kita kaji dan kita kembangkan. Orang yang berhasil sukses mengarungi hari ini salah satunya orang, komunitas, lembaga, institusi, bahkan negara yang banyak memberikan inovasi dan kreativitas. Tentu dakwah juga begitu tantangannya. Yang ketiga tentu jangan lupa, we need to learn continuously about the skill to use technology in dakwah. Banyak catatan para dakwah kita harus belajar cepat, tidak gaptek terhadap teknologi. Karena keberhasilan hari ini adalah keberhasilan teknologi. Termasuk the fourth, yang keempat menurut saya, interpersonal skill. Seorang harus mampu mengembangkan dirinya dalam rangka komunikasi dan human network. Dan ini penting untuk kita lakukan. Yang terakhir menurut saya, dakwah in this era of technology should be accessible and inclusive. Education, knowledge is everyone's need. It is so to be easy to access everyone and everything, every time, everywhere. Karena itu sebetulnya kebutuhan dakwah hari ini adalah dakwah yang inklusif, dakwah yang santun, dakwah yang rahmatan lil alamin, dakwah yang moderat. Di Universitas Islam Negeri Walisongo perlu kami laporkan kepada Gus Menteri, kita sudah mendirikan rumah moderasi beragama sejak tahun 2019, yang itu bagian dari komitmen kita bagaimana menjadikan Islam, agama kita, agama yang betul-betul menginspirasi, agama yang menjadi inspirasi bagi semua masyarakat bangsa dan negara, khususnya umat Islam. Islam agama santun, Islam agama ramah, apalagi di UIN Walisongo. Nama besar Walisongo bukan sekedar nama sembarangan, itu nama yang penuh barokah. Kita harus ngalah barokah dengan nama kebesaran Walisongo. Sosok-sosok yang berdakwah secara santun, dakwah yang lembut, dakwah yang sukses, dakwah yang berhasil, tanpa meninggalkan kesulitan, kegalauan, dan juga bahkan kekerasan. Kesuksesan Walisongo menurut saya inspirasi luar biasa bagi kita, khususnya pada hari ini dalam rangka melaksanakan seminar internasional yang luar biasa hebatnya. Yang terakhir, kami sampaikan terima kasih, jelas, thanks for you all, especially khususnya kepada Gus Menteri Agama. Pak Menteri, Gus Menteri, terima kasih atas hadirnya secara langsung dalam kesempatan ini. Kita sangat paham, sangat sadar betapa sangat waktu yang luar biasa kehadiran Gus Menteri di ruangan kita hari ini, di tengah super sibuk dengan urusan bangsa dan negara. Kita berdoa mudah-mudahan Gus Menteri selalu diberi kesehatan oleh Allah SWT, dan kita semuanya bisa menjalankan komitmen dan tugas sebagai abdi negara, sebagai insan-insan yang berkontribusi untuk bangsa dan negara. Saya ucapkan terima kasih kepada semuanya atas hadirnya dalam forum ini, dan yang paling terakhir kami mohonkan Gus Men untuk memberikan arahan, sambutan, keynote speech, juga sekaligus membuka acara ini secara resmi. Sebelum ditutup, ada pantun untuk Gus Menteri dan kita semuanya. Virus dan bakteri akan musnah bila kita selalu menerapkan protokol kesehatan. Gus Menteri Yakut, komandan yang gagah mengawal bangsa dalam harmoni dan perdamaian. Terima kasih. Ihdinas shiratal mustaqim, wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Shalatu wassalamu ala asyrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin. Sayyidina wa maulana Muhammadin wa ala alihi washabihi ajmain. Yang saya hormati Profesor Robert Hefner, yang saya hormati Profesor Florian Paul, yang saya hormati Bisipo, saya hormati Dr. Zainal Abidin Bakir, dan tentu yang saya cintai sahabat saya Rektor UIN Walisongo, Profesor Imam Taufik. Actually, I want to convey in English, but I'm afraid that only me understand what I convey there. You know, my English is messed up, so I will present my speech in Indonesia, in bahasa. Assalamualaikum, pada kesempatan yang berbahagia ini, mari kita semua senantiasa mengucapkan rasa syukur kehadirat Allah SWT. Alhamdulillah pada pagi hari ini kita semua bisa mengikuti seminar internasional yang luar biasa ini. Meskipun tadi saya sempat melihat pesertanya orang Indonesia semua, kecuali pembicara ya. Tapi nggak apa-apa. Yang penting skalanya internasional. Dan saya kira saya menyampaikan dalam bahasa Indonesia ini nanti lebih mudah diterima daripada saya sampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris saya yang mess up itu, yang kacau. Jadi Bapak Ibu sekalian, para peserta webinar, tentu kita juga wajib bersyukur dan memanjatkan menyampaikan sholawat serta salam kita kepada junjungan Nabi Muhammad SAW serta keluarga, sahabat dan orang-orang yang beriman yang selalu mengikuti beliau. Pada kesempatan yang baik ini saya ingin sekali lagi mengapresiasi atas pelaksanaan International Conference yang diinisiasi oleh Walisongo ini di bawah pimpinan Prof. Imam Taufik. Temanya juga menarik, Modern Islam Promoting Tolerance and Harmony in the Digital Era. Saya kira tema yang sangat relevan dengan visi dan misi Kementerian Agama saat ini yang saya pimpin, yang akan terus-menerus dan tidak akan berhenti mempromosikan program moderasi beragama. Karena sesungguhnya moderasi beragama ini adalah kekayaan sekaligus kekuatan bangsa kita. Tema moderasi beragama ini sebenarnya sudah banyak juga didiskusikan oleh para akademisi, oleh para peneliti, dan tentu expert gitu ya, dari latar belakang yang berbeda, dan dirasakan bahwa pemahaman, sikap, dan perilaku keagamaan yang tidak ekstrim ini terus-menerus mendapatkan dan menghadapi tantangan. Saya ingin contohkan sedikit, misalnya hari ini bagaimana ramai dengan isu Bahai. Saya menyampaikan selamat hari raya kepada komunitas Bahai, dan banyak orang yang komplain, dianggap bahwa Bahai ini adalah aliran sesat. Padahal Bahai ini agama tersendiri, agama yang terpisah, dan perlindungan terhadap kebebasan beragama itu dijamin oleh konstitusi. Jadi saya kira sebagai warga negara semua ini harus dilindungi, apapun kepercayaannya, apapun keyakinannya, apapun agamanya. Jadi mereka memiliki hak yang sama, untuk dapat perhatian dan dilindungi oleh pemerintah dalam hal kewarganegaraan. Untuk itulah saya kira Kementerian Agama saat ini sangat concern untuk terus mengembangkan moderasi beragama, ya, karena ini juga penting untuk menangkal ancaman yang ada di depan mata, baik itu bibit ekstremisme yang menjadi musuh nyata bagi keberagaman dan kebangsaan kita, maupun sikap-sikap yang menafikan atau cenderung bertentangan dengan konstitusi. Jadi saya kira pekerjaan kita selain moderasi beragama ini, mengkampanyekan terus-menerus moderasi beragama, juga adalah bagaimana kita tegak lurus terhadap konstitusi. Jadi kita tidak boleh menyalahi konstitusi selama kita ini hidup berbangsa dan bernegara atas nama apapun. Dalam kehidupan bernegara saya kira konstitusi ini menjadi pegangan utama kita. Hadirin peserta seminar yang saya hormati, Indonesia ini merupakan bangsa yang kaya dengan suku, budaya, dan banyak sekali bahasa. Jadi bisa kita bayangkan bagaimana kita ini mengelola diversity yang luar biasa tersebut ini pasti tidak mudah. Keberagaman yang demikian kaya ini sebenarnya bisa kita lihat sebagai sebuah peluang kita semua untuk saling memperkuat satu sama lain dan menjadikan sebagai sumber persatuan yang kita kenal dengan Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, atau kalau dalam bahasanya Profesor Imam Taufik ini, harmony in diversity. Jadi jika tidak mampu kita mengelola keragaman ini dengan baik, saya kira ini akan mewujud menjadi sebuah ancaman yang sangat membahayakan. Kondisi ini juga bisa diperparah dengan perkembangan zaman dan situasi saat ini. Kita tahu bagaimana kemajuan media dan teknologi yang sangat cepat merubah hampir semua lini kehidupan. Begitu juga dalam bidang keagamaan, banyak penyalir, banyak kita tengarai gitu ya. Sebagian besar orang belajar atau mendapatkan asupan-asupan pemahaman agamaan dan isu-isu agama lainnya itu secara instan dari media. Lebih banyak belajar dari WhatsApp daripada belajar dari kiai atau ustadz. Nah, ini fenomena. Saya kira fenomena ini didominasi oleh provider yang memang menyediakan pemahaman keagamaan yang sempit, kadang cenderung menebarkan kebencian terhadap sesama pemeluk agama maupun yang berbeda agama. Bahkan kebencian terhadap negaranya. Kita tahu nih, hoax. hoax, berita-berita palsu, berita-berita yang penuh kebencian hari-hari ini beredar luar biasa. Pemerintah sekarang diserang, dianggap tidak mampu menangani pandemi COVID, orang pada menyerah, mengibarkan bendera putih. Ini sepertinya kita ini kadang-kadang lupa bersyukur. Kalau kita bandingkan misalnya dengan India, bagaimana warga negara India ini ketika menghadapi COVID harus sendirian. Ya, kita ini dengan segala keterbatasan kita bersyukur bahwa penanganan pandemi, misalnya orang-orang yang terdampak pandemi terkena virus COVID-19 ini dibiayai oleh negara dalam pengobatannya. Ini saya kira akan sangat jarang kita temui di tempat lain. Kurangan kita ya kurang bersyukur itu. Jadi untuk itu sekali lagi saya berharap melalui seminar yang luar biasa ini nanti kita semua bisa mengambil langkah yang lebih konkret untuk mewarnai dunia digital, ya, dunia digital atau media yang saat ini berkembang agar nuansa moderasi beragama bisa tersampaikan kepada semua pihak. Jadi akan sangat sayang webinar internasional ini hanya berhenti di kita saja. Mari apapun nanti hasilnya, selama itu baik dan untuk kebaikan, kita sebarkan seluas-luasnya. Hadirin yang berbahagia, akhirnya selaku Menteri Agama dan mewakili pemerintah Indonesia, sekali lagi saya mengucapkan selamat berseminar, selamat berdiskusi secara virtual ya. Semoga tidak mengurangi keseriusan kita semua dalam mempromosikan ajaran agama yang membawa kebaikan bersama dengan ciri yang inklusif, anti kekerasan, dan mampu menghargai keragaman dalam kehidupan berbangsa, bernegara, serta tentu untuk membangun peradaban dunia atau contributing to peace to the world. Dengan demikian, Bapak Ibu sekalian, saudara-saudara saya hormati, Profesor Imam Taufik yang saya cintai, dan resmi seminar internasional ini saya buka. Selamat berdiskusi, semoga membawa manfaat. Demikian, wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih, Gus.
Emang tenang? Ora tenang piye to kowe ngerti dhewe semenjak ponakanku kuliah ning Walisongo ora tau bali. Gek. Ngerti dhewe berita paling aneh kae. Ana bom bunuh diri arang kae lho.
Barangan kowe, ora mungkin mahasiswa Walisongo Semarang koyo ngono. Kampus iki terkenal kampus moderat.
Dicek sih. Emangnya kowe kenal karo karyawan kene po?
Karyawane Pak Rektor kene karo aku kene.
Wah, kenal apa? Kowe.
Waalaikumsalam, Pak Ben. Ada apa ini?
Ini Pak, saya itu ngantar warga. Mencari keponakannya, katanya kuliah di sini Pak.
Emangnya ponakannya kenapa?
Ini Pak Rektor, ponakan saya semenjak kuliah di Walisongo jadi gak betah di rumah, gak pernah pulang.
Mungkin ponakanmu yang kena udah pacar, dan mau ning omah.
Jadi arep kuliah ning Walisongo iki golek ora golek mantu.
Iya.
Emangnya ponakannya jurusan apa? Nah, di UIN ini jurusannya banyak, ada 48, 60%-nya sudah terakreditasi.
Jurusan apa ponakanmu?
Purwokerto Semarang.
Panak bis wae.
Ya udah, ayo kita cari naik bis trek. Ya.
Wah, kampusnya enak
Google ya Pak.
Iya Bapak Ben. Kampus ini kita desain siswa agar kuliahnya kesasan, nyaman dan cepet lulus berkualitas.
Ayo.
Waduh. Bapak Ben, kae ponanku.
Pak Ade di sini. Lagi siapa tuh?
Ponanku.
Oh, jadi gini Mas, kita semua lagi nyari jenengan karena beberapa hari ini nggak pulang rumah. Ini loh Pak, senang-senang betah di rumah tuh senang-senang di sini karena suasana kampus nyaman aja.
Jangan Pak Babin. Nek suasanane kampus kayak ngene iki, jangan ponakan anu belum kuliah ning kene. Nggih Pak.
Ora iso lah, belum sana coba ada kuliah ning kene.
Iso. Bisa kok Pak. Besok pagi jam 4 datang ke kampus. Emangnya kuliah subuh.
Sing acara ini kuwi.
I am here. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. Thank you very much. Good morning here from Atlanta. Selamat pagi dari Atlanta. I want to thank the organizers first for inviting me and letting me speak. I'm obviously partial, as you will have seen from the introduction, to Walisongo, given that I was lucky enough to spend a year there. So I'm very happy that we have continued opportunities to collaborate. So thank you to the organizers, Fakultas Dakwah and Comunnication, for inviting me. A big thank you also to the representatives from the ministry and from the rector's office for supporting this conference and for opening it in such a festive way. And then thank you, Utara, for the wonderful introduction and the moderation. I'll share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation here, so you get to see what I will be talking about. And we talk about the things that we pretend to know a little bit about, but certainly the things that we care about. And I do care very much about the study of religion within higher education. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of what I see inspiring developments in the field of religious studies in Indonesian state Islamic higher education in the WUIN system. But I also want to point maybe forward and push back a little bit in order to push our conversation on to some potential blind spots that I can detect from my vantage point and from given my specific interests. So some blind spots that I can also see in the way in which the study of religion is conceptualized, and where the study of agama can sometimes therefore become perhaps an unwitting tool to promote the interests of some over those of others. And so although our idea is to promote tolerance and harmony with our study, we might end up actually reinforcing dominant discourses that actually promote perhaps sameness and at the same time marginalize difference. So they do the exact opposite of what we intend. And so that's what I mean by the dimensions, the priestly and prophetic dimensions. You will perhaps see there a reference to the civil religion debate by some of the American scholars, from Robert Bella to Wisno and Martin Marty used this distinction as well, and I'll come to that in a second. So let me start by making clear that I'm certainly not a neutral observer of developments in perbandingan agama or the studi agama-agama departments in Indonesian state Islamic higher education institutions. As Butara said, I was a visiting scholar at Walisongo in the facultas. At that point, it was still called Usuluddin. And PA Perbandingan Agama was housed in that facultas. And so I had asked Fulbright to place me with the Prodi PA because of the historical significance of PA in promoting tolerance and harmony from the time of Mukti Ali onwards, but also in the post-reformasi period. PA, as part, of course, of Perguruan Tinggi Agama Islam Negeri, but PA specifically as a prodi was certainly known beyond Indonesia, as Herman Beck called it once, a pillar of social harmony. And so, as somebody who myself is in a department of religious studies, I was eager to be, at least for a while, a member of that community in Indonesia as well. And as you can see here, I mean, we experienced together all those wonderful things that I myself would expect from a program that prizes, as the conference is entitled, the promotion of tolerance and harmony. Here we're going to an Imlek celebration at a Chinese temple in Semarang in 2015. And we did a service project there while also participating, observing the Imlek celebrations of the community in Semarang. However, I also very, very quickly realized that the Perbandingan Agama had come under some intense scrutiny within the educational environment. So the upgrading of the EIN system to UINs also meant that now PA had to compete with lots more demands for funding and for students, and so there had been something of a, we could call it perhaps a waning trend in enrollment. Parents and students were asking, what kinds of qualifications do I receive when I enroll in PA? And so this, the idea that all of our disciplines, our fields now have to make explicit what kinds of qualifications they provide for students. That was a challenge for PA that I quickly became familiar with. And then second, there was the larger social, political debate over what counts as proper Islam in Indonesia, and a kind of growing sense of a competition for priority in the public sphere of different versions of Islam, where the proponents of this study of religion, of PA, perbandingan agama, became increasingly accused of not teaching the right Islam, for leading students astray. So accusations of heterodoxy were part of that dilemma of these challenges as well. And so I was lucky enough, though, that early on, it was in November of 2014, not long after my arrival in Semarang, one of my colleagues, Afnan Ansuri, took me to Jogja, to the inaugural, the founding meeting of ASAI, the Asosiasi Studi Agama Indonesia. So a group of representatives of different Prodi PA throughout Indonesia, mostly from the UIN network, but there were also representatives from Muhammadiyah universities, came together to address head-on some of these challenges that I had just outlined earlier. And they came up with a number of ways in which they were hoping to promote the study of religion, to justify it, to give it a disciplinary identity that would distinguish it enough to receive funding, to receive students, to be somewhat attractive, both within the system of state Islamic higher education, but also within the wider context of Indonesian society. And so they recommended a name change from Perbandingan Agama to Studi Agama, because they felt that the perbandingan, the comparative, gave rise to misconceptions about what it was that was being studied in their programs. But they also made recommendations for funding, for perhaps required courses in different fields of study that include the Studi Agama perspective. But there were also really a kind of an institutional response, a networking response to build up each other's programs against the challenges that the study of religion was facing. And ASAI has gone on to be quite successful. I think it's in its third iteration of board rotation. So it's an ongoing and quite successful network that has led, in some sense, to actually new programs in the study of religion being established. The EIN Pontianak and Comunnication both more recently have added programs in the study of religion to their select prodi. And the programs in the study of religion at other universities have gone through accreditation processes that have worked out generally quite well. So, the colleague I mentioned earlier, Afnan and I, we have been, as a result of our joint interest in seeing the founding of ASAI and future developments, we have devised a curriculum study of the curricula for Studi Agama in these programs in the WIN system that we're still currently undertaking. Afnan would say, when you look at these pictures of things that are happening at different PA or Studi Agama programs, that we can see something of a renaissance of the study of religion, vibrant departments that engage students and the wider community in questions of social relevance. And he points to activities that we can see depicted, for instance, here. I want to, however, just briefly share some observations what stands out to us when we're looking at the curriculum documents for these Studi Agama programs. I think the one thing that stands out initially most is that there's some strong continuity, if you will, with the Perbandingan Agama paradigm of an openness, a promotion toward tolerance and harmony. So again, just like under Mukti Ali, a variety of intellectual traditions are engaged, not just European ones, not just Middle Eastern ones, but also there's a clear dialogue orientation that was also pronounced from the beginnings under Mufti Ali. But the social engagement has become more described, I would say. We can see that quite a number of programs, and the program at Walisongo is an example of that. Very, very directly connect the focus of the Perbandingan Agama program with issues of contemporary relevance. So for Walisongo, as you know, it's conflict resolution in collaboration with the Conflict Resolution Center. But in other WIN programs that have Studi Agama, it might be an orientation toward service in the local community, outreach toward particular local communities like at Sunan Ampel in Surabaya. So this social engagement certainly something that in the intensity with which it's foregrounded is something new. It's being scaled up compared to earlier times. There's also a broader range of traditions that are being studied and engaged than under Mufti Ali, and maybe something that carefully we could call a more egalitarian view of the non-recognized traditions. So at least those that don't have the official status of Agama. What stands out as a political document in these curriculums of PA, and that is something that our interviews with the Kepala Prodi and some of the lecturers in these programs comes out very clearly, and that we see in the founding documents of ASAI as well, is that this vision of what Perbandingan Agama or Studi Agama is supposed to be is outlined under reference very explicitly to Pancasila. And so on the one hand, I would say that's not surprising. We see this in other spheres in Indonesian society as well, because it conveys a strategic advantage to proponents of Studi Agama and their version of Islam, when it can be tied to established and still quite powerful cultural norms such as Pancasila. So there's certainly a way in which tying the confessional understanding of Islam that proponents share to the established, we could call it de facto civil religion in Indonesia. So there's a strategic advantage, but there are also, and that's what I want to end on and push us into the conversation if we can, there are also some limitations that we would see with that strategy. One limitation is that while under Mufti Ali, and certainly to a large extent today as well, the way in which this vision of publicly relevant Islam dovetails with the state incentives or the encouragement of the state for politically relevant Islam. That currently is an advantage, but state incentives tend to change, and there's certainly the possibility that in the not-too-distant future there might be different state incentives for other versions that leave proponents of SRR in the backwater. So the state incentives are historically fickle, perhaps. But the point that stands out more to us is one that we would call the priestly prophetic function with which proponents of SR link back to the Panchasila. So in some ways, there is clearly something to be gained from tying back or borrowing the authority of Panchasila. But that's a very, what Martin Markey would call a very priestly way of engaging with the civil religion. The Panchasila, we know, is also historically a compromise document. It certainly has a quite narrow concept of what qualifies as a legitimate form of religion. And so to push the more prophetic engagement with civil religion, with Panchasila, that can also be a critique or an expansion of the civil religion. That is something that we see as still being possible to expand. So, for instance, we see a near total absence in the curriculum of any kind of conceptual study of the conceptual history of agama, of religion, right? The idea of religion is not in the curriculum, at least, critically engaged. So that's not unique to the Indonesian context in this case. I mean, we look at religion programs here in the US, which I am more familiar with, and we rarely do this either. But what happens is that what we don't investigate is that the categories such as religion, agama as functional equivalent, that we use to divide our world, they're not natural, they're not just a given, but they are tied up with issues of power, interest, and identity. And so not seriously engaging the conceptual history of our core concepts can, of course, reinforce dominant political discourses. So while we say that we are now also looking at no longer at kearifan lokal, but now we're looking at agama lokal, broadening the tent to include other traditions under the banner of agama can also be a limiting strategy, because we're accommodating perhaps sameness, if you will. We're only allowing those dimensions of the other to really enter our field of vision that don't challenge our self-perception. And so it's that what I would call a discursive or critical study of religion that I think would be useful in this context, because the question for me remains if a broader tent alone is enough, that we're including more traditions under the banner of agama, or if we also need to have more conceptual clarity for us, for our students, and perhaps for the society who we serve in our knowledge making, so that we're not unaware of the political and conceptual baggage of our disciplines as well. So that is an ongoing challenge, something I see. I'll leave it there, and thank you all. Apologize for any shortcomings in my presentation, and look forward to more discussion in a little bit.
Nggih. Baik ya. Terima kasih. Suara saya bisa didengar? Tanpa itu echo. Oke. Saya mau mengucapkan terima kasih atas undangan ini dan mengucapkan terima kasih kepada wakil dari Menteri Agama dan juga kepada Pak Dekan dan Pak Dekan di Supena yang kalau tidak salah adalah convener dari program ini, dan saya akan berbahas dan saya juga mau mengucapkan terima kasih kepada bapak dan ibu-ibu dan saudara-saudara sekalian atas undangan ini yang saya muliakan. Saya mungkin hari ini akan berbicara baik dalam bahasa Indonesia maupun bahasa Inggris. Jadi nyuwun sewu nggih menawi Boso Jawi betul sakit malah dados ngangge Inggris utawi menapa nika bahasa Indonesia. Oke. Suara saya bisa didengar? Ya. Okay. When I received the invitation, I wasn't sure what language I was supposed to speak, so I just put some brief thoughts together, and I didn't prepare a PowerPoint because I thought we were primarily going to be discussing in a somewhat more informal manner. Jadi saya pakai bahasa Indonesia dan bahasa Inggris, dan komentar saya sangat singkat. So I want to begin today, though, by emphasizing, by locating Indonesia di seluruh dunia. Dan tantangan toleransi dan kerukunan itu jelas bukan sesuatu yang ciri khas Indonesia. In fact, the challenge of living together in deep pluralism, as it's sometimes called, pluralisme dalam ataupun kebinekaan dalam itu merupakan salah satu tantangan yang dialami di seluruh dunia. Kita tahu sejak tahun 2011 ada yang disebut Arab Spring, musim semi di Arab yang dengan kecualian Indonesia semua gagal. Lain dari proses transisi kembali ke Indonesia, ke demokrasi di Indonesia, gagal semua dengan kecualian Tunisia. Dan belakangan ini, minggu ini, Tunisia pun mengalami tantangan lagi. Baik di sebagian besar dari negara-negara Arab, terutama belakangan ini ada banyak pengamat politik dan agama yang menegaskan bahwa ada semacam krisis kewarganegaraan di negara-negara itu. Tapi problem ini, tantangan ini sekali lagi bukan ciri khas, tidak sama sekali ciri khas Indonesia atau negara Muslim. Dan maaf juga saya harus tegaskan, ini hari ini saya mengalami kecelakaan, jadi my face is not very good looking tonight. Oke, maafkan ya, ini ada kecelakaan tadi kemarin. Kalau kita pindah ke negara-negara yang mayoritas Hindu, yang saya maksudkan jelas India. India adalah negara demokrasi yang terbesar di Indonesia, yang menjalankan di seluruh dunia, yang menjalankan sistem demokratis selama lebih dari 50 tahun dengan baik. Tapi dari dalam sistem demokrasi itu, belakangan ini, sebetulnya lebih dari 20 tahun yang lalu, timbul sebuah gerakan majoritarian yang disebut Hindutva. Dan salah satu ciri khas dari Hindutva adalah Islamofobia. Islamofobia pada tingkat yang luar biasa besar. di Rohingya di Myanmar belakangan ini, dan di Sri Lanka pun. Dua negara Buddhis dan Barat, kedua negara ini juga mengalami sebuah tantangan pluralisme, tantangan kebinekaan. Dan juga sekali lagi salah satu ciri dari tantangan itu adalah naiknya timbulnya Islamofobia juga, terutama terhadap di Myanmar, orang Muslim yang Rohingya. Tapi tidak hanya di situ pun, kalau kita sekarang pindah fokus ke negara-negara Barat, negara-negara yang sering mau menganggap diri negara demokratis, kadang-kadang mereka mau dianggap negara liberal sama rata. Belakangan ini juga, dan tidak hanya belakangan ini, tapi selama 20 tahun terakhir ini, kita melihat bahwa ada tantangan kemajemukan, tantangan kewarganegaraan yang drastis, yang serius juga. Tapi itu di Perancis dengan naiknya National Front Nasional, di Belanda dengan beberapa perkembangan belakangan ini, di Austria, apalagi di Amerika Serikat di bawah pimpinan Donald Trump, yang juga main kartu agama, main kartu nasionalisme Kristen, di mana makna dari konsep Kristen itu dikosongkan, menurut saya dikosongkan, saya pakai bahasa yang sedikit kasar, dikosongkan, seolah-olah itu menjadi simbol saja, simbol nasionalis saja, tidak mempunyai inti yang agamis, yang benar, yang adil, yang fair, yang benar. So what are we to do in this situation? It's not just, therefore, in Muslim majority countries that we see a challenge of pluralism. And it's certainly not just in Indonesia. Because in many countries, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the United States, we see around the world processes of social mobility, processes of new social media. Anda, bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu semua di sini adalah dari Fakultas Dakwah dan Komunikasi, jadi Anda pasti tahu bahwa salah satu faktor di dalam naiknya krisis kewarganegaraan di sebagian besar dari negara ini adalah bentuk public forum yang baru melewati social media, medsos, yang mengajak sebuah partisipasi yang sebetulnya dapat menghindari intimacy, sociability yang ramah, dan target segment of the market of the communications market in a way so as to invite a coarsening of public discourse, a coarsening of public knowledge, a coarsening of the way in which we understand our faiths, be it Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, a coarsening, dikasarkan. Nilai-nilai itu dikasarkan melewati sebuah populisme epistemologis, an epistemological populism. This is a characteristic of this crisis of citizenship, of this crisis of national culture that we see in many countries around the world. And it's in this setting, I think, that Indonesia has a positive lesson to argue. Many people, when I first began studying Indonesia, this was lebih dari 40 tahun yang lalu, atau 40 tahun yang lalu, saya terjun ke lapangan di Indonesia. Dan saya ingat selama sebagian besar dari 40 tahun itu, sebagian besar dari pengamat internasional sangat skeptis. Waktu saya menegaskan bahwa sebetulnya Indonesia mengalami suatu proses tidak hanya setelah 98-99, tapi sebelumnya sebuah proses intelektualisasi agama, intelektualisasi studi agama seperti yang ditegaskan itu tadi oleh Pak Paul. Saya sangat setuju dengan presentasinya. Tapi sebuah intelektualisasi seperti ditegaskan Pak Zamakhsyir Dovir lebih dari 30 tahun yang lalu, Pak Zamakshir Dovir yang dari UIN Jakarta, dia juga membahas the intellectualization of Islam. Dan dari pengalaman itu dengan pembentukan IAIN, kemudian IAIN menjadi UIN, ada semacam ekspansi kurikulum seperti yang ditegaskan Pak Florian Paul itu tadi. Indonesia dan terutama institusi-institusi DAPAD dan Depdikbud mengalami sebuah pembaruan, renovasi dalam pendekatan yang diterapkan, yang ditembangkan tidak hanya terhadap agama dan agama Islam, tapi juga hal-hal seperti kewarganegaraan. Saya ingat karena pada dasawarsa 90 saya sebagian besar dari tiap tahun selama dasawarsa itu saya ke Jakarta untuk ketemu dengan Cak Nur, Gus Dur, Daumar Harjo, orang Ijmi, dan banyak cendekiawan Muslim yang lain. Dan saya ingat, tiap tahun ada perkembangan baru, tiap tahun ada semacam peluasan, an enlarging of the public sphere, and of the ideas discussed in the public sphere. Dan dalam hal ini, saya tekankan sebelum transisi kembali ke demokrasi pada tahun 98-99, sudah ada sebuah landasan intelektual yang disediakan, dilewati atau melalui program-program di IAIN yang kemudian menjadi IAIN, tapi juga program di Universitas Muhammadiyah, tapi juga program-program di Lakpestam, NU, di mana-mana di Indonesia. Pada dasawarsa di mana seperti saya tegaskan itu tadi, sebagian besar dari teman saya di luar negeri, kalau saya dengar saya ngomong dengan optimis, dengan jiwa optimis tentang Indonesia pada dasawarsa itu, mereka sangat skeptis. Karena mereka selalu ditekankan, wah, pada dasawarsa 50-an, 60-an, Indonesia hancur. Ada pembunuhan, ada kompetisi aliran itu pada dasawarsa 50-an sampai 65, kemudian ada pembunuhan massa dan PKI dan sekalinya. Bagaimana bisa orang sangat skeptis menganggap bahwa Indonesia adalah a problem state, a failed state. Tapi saya sejak dasawarsa 70-an, 80-an, 90-an tegaskan, enggak. Dari tengah krisis itu, krisis kewarganegaraan dan kebangsaan itu pada tahun 50-an dan 60-an, timbul suatu generasi baru, suatu pikiran baru, suatu kembali istilah Zamakshir Dovir itu tadi, semacam intelektualisasi. Tidak hanya terhadap studi agama, walaupun itu juga dan itu sangat penting, tapi juga terhadap hal-hal kebangsaan. Nah, inilah keistimewaan Indonesia. Dan inilah sebabnya waktu Indonesia akhirnya kembali ke era demokrasi setelah tahun 98-99, siapa yang paling berperan dalam misalnya pembentukan bahan studi kewarganegaraan? Orang dari UIN. Dari UIN. Siapa yang paling merintis perkembangan pembentukan bahan tentang gender studies? Itu sekali lagi orang perempuan dan laki-laki kadang-kadang. Dari UIN. Apalagi waktu Menteri Agama mohon agar ada program paket baru tentang kewarganegaraan, siapa yang menyediakan itu? Bukan orang dari Universitas Indonesia atau Gajah Mada, walaupun itu kedua institut perguruan tinggi yang saya selalu salut. Tapi sekali lagi, Depag dan Depdikbud kembali ke UIN. Nah, jadi ada beberapa faktor, beberapa variabel yang menjelaskan kok bagaimana bisa Indonesia yang pada satu saat mengalami suatu krisis kebangsaan dan kewarganegaan yang parah sekali, apalagi krisis ekonomi pada akhir dasawarsa 50-an dan awal 60-an, Indonesia timbul tidak hanya dari sekali lagi tidak hanya dari segi atau dari sudut ekonomi, tapi dari sudut kultur nasional. Jelas masih ada kekurangan, masih ada isu-isu yang harus dibahas, ditinjau kembali, seperti yang ditegaskan itu tadi oleh Pak Paul. Salah satu hal adalah agama-agama lokal. Definisi agama yang diterapkan, misalnya, di Departemen Agama, walaupun menurut saya, hasil dari pembicaraan saya dengan Litbang Depak, saya selalu mengambil kesimpulan, saya sangat mengesankan bahwa di situ pun ada gagasan baru dan ada semacam intelektualisasi terhadap konsep agama, dan seperti yang ditegaskan Pak Paul itu tadi, semacam emphasis tentang kepentingan untuk kontekstualisasi baru agar supaya semua warga negara Indonesia bisa diterima. Walaupun itu satu hal yang sangat rumit, tidak hanya di Indonesia, tapi di negara-negara barat. Di definisi agama di Jerman, di Perancis itu sangat terbatas. Tidak seperti di Amerika Serikat, seseorang mau menciptakan agama baru, silakan, itu pasar bebas. Tapi itu bukan itu sistem yang diterapkan di sebagian besar dari negara-negara demokratis di barat. Dan jadi dalam hal ini, tantangan itu yang saya tegaskan itu tadi, ya, definisi agama dan pengelolaan agama, itu bukan semacam tantangan yang ciri khas Indonesia, itu umum. Sesuatu yang betul-betul harus dibahas dan ditinjau kembali terus-menerus di semua negara yang demokratis. Saya berakhir hari ini dengan sebuah observasi tentang tantangan menurut saya yang paling besar di Indonesia. Dan sekali lagi saya tekankan bahwa tantangan yang paling besar itu sebetulnya sama saja dengan sebagian besar dari negara-negara demokratis yang lain. Selalu ada kurangan. Yang satu itu adalah sistem patronage, patron clientism. Di mana-mana di dunia ini sama saja, baik di negara demokratis maupun yang tidak demokratis. Seperti di Filipina. Filipina ya setengah demokratis, setengah tidak. Tapi patronage di Amerika pun. Lihatlah Trump, naiknya Trump. Jadi itu salah satu tantangan besar. Tapi yang paling mencemaskan mungkin adalah waktu sistem patronage itu, apa itu di Barat, di Filipina, di Muang Thai, Thailand, atau di Indonesia. Waktu ada semacam konvergensi antara persaingan ekonomi politik itu dan politisasi agama. Atau di Amerika, agama dan etnisitas. Itu yang paling bahaya. Karena perkembangan konvergensi itu, kerjasama itu antara patron yang sebetulnya mengutarakan kepentingan dia sendiri, dan kelompok-kelompok tertentu yang melihat bahwa, oh, kalau saya kerjasama dengan wong gede itu, saya didukung terus-menerus. Sekali lagi, ini di mana-mana di dunia ini salah satu tantangan yang paling besar. Dan waktu kerjasama itu sebetulnya mempolitisasikan, politicizes religious sentiments, itu yang paling bahaya. Dan di situ pun saya masih optimis, walaupun saya tahu apa itu di Amerika, di Indonesia, saya masih optimis. Kedua negara ini, kalau boleh saya ngomong sebagai warga negara Amerika dan pecinta Indonesia, saya masih optimis walaupun kedua negara ini tetap menghadapi tantangan. Kedua negara ini mempunyai tradisi kebangsaan yang bertahan, yang akan bertahan, dan bisa menghadapi tantangan seperti yang saya gambarkan itu tadi. Tantangan konvergensi antara elit-elit, oligark, patronage, dan politisasi agama. Itu yang paling bahaya, tapi itu juga sesuatu yang sekali lagi tradisi kebangsaan dan kewargaan Indonesia dan sumbangan masyarakat Muslim di Indonesia, terutama UIN, IAIN itu menjamin bahwa, atau menurut saya menimbulkan harapan bahwa itu pun, tantangan itu pun jelas akan dihadapi dan diatasi dengan baik, dengan kesamaratan, dengan jiwa nasional bangsaan. Cukup begini. Terima kasih. Semua sugeng injing sudoyo, matur nuwun sangat. Saya kira mute. Masih mute. Sekarang bisa. Sebelum belum bisa. Enggak.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen, and hopefully that works. Well, assalamu alaikum. It is good to be with you, and our prayers are with Indonesia as it goes through this time of pandemic resurgence. And we will continue to pray for you as you go through this time and the rest of the world, obviously. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to have this conversation. It's a conversation that we need to be having within every religious tradition. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, less of a scholarly approach and more of a personal approach, a practitioner approach as a person of faith and thinking about the issues before us. And in so many ways, asking a question that I heard implied in Bob's presentation about the crisis of citizenship, which is what are the resources within our traditions that preserve citizenship, a spiritual citizenship, a global citizenship, and a national citizenship? What are the resources within that help us live with our deepest differences? I've chosen for my title the first theme of the conference, which is toward an effective Islamic moderate. I have Islamic in parentheses because I think that you could insert any religion there, given the times that we're in and the tour de force that Bob gave around the world of the different countries that are facing these issues. It could be Christian, Hindu, Buddhism, but the topic today is Islam. I also have moderate in quotes because I think there is a dignified difference but clear relationship between theological non-moderation and political moderation. So some caveats here. One, I'm speaking as an American who is outside of Islam and outside of Indonesia, although I love your country and have been there. I'm also speaking from my own context as an American. I be careful to remember that, but if there are things from my observations as an American who has had experience with Islam around the world, let's have a discussion about that. But it's very much from my perspective about what the word moderate means and can mean in certain contexts. By dignified, I mean simply, I believe God gives everybody dignity. That dignity is illustrated in how we think differently, the freedom to think and inquire, which is the essence of the academy, but the essence of freedom of speech and the freedom to gather, the freedom of a democracy. By theological, I mean our relationship, our individual relationship with God. What is our understanding and study of that relationship? How do we understand ourselves in relation to God? And by political, I mean our relationship to each other. How do we people of faith build a community and a culture where we can live with our deepest differences? So theological non-moderation is about the relationship to God. Political moderation is horizontal and about our relationship to each other, because we have the freedom to express our God-given dignity in different ways that are often irreconcilable. So since this invitation was issued from the Faculty of Dakwah and Communication, I thought I might share a story about how Islam was first shared with me. And I hope that by sharing this story of Dakwah that I had the experience, that there might be some reflections that will help you think about the use of moderate and moderation in your own context. Between the years 2005 and 2011, I had the opportunity and great blessing to spend quite a bit of time on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan with the Pashtun people. And I also had the opportunity to go to Syria and spend some time with those precious people. In both contexts, I had the great privilege of being invited to speak in a madrasa. And after my presentation, I had an identical experience in both Peshawar, Pakistan, and Hama, Syria. A young man, a Muslim obviously, came up to me after my presentation, very earnest, very much at peace with himself, at peace with the world. And he said to me, "Dr. Saipo, your words sound like the Prophet, peace be upon him. Please finish your journey. Please come and be a Muslim." And those experiences, nearly identical, are something that I've thought about for the last 10 to 15 years quite often. What am I supposed to do with that invitation? How do I think about that? And so I want to share with you 5 reflections that I hope can contribute to our conversation about moderation. And here are the 5 reflections from those 2 experiences in Pakistan and Syria. Reflection number 1, there is no greater honor than for somebody to care so much about your soul that they would ask you to change your beliefs and walk with them in their spiritual journey and their religious tradition. Not everybody would think that way, but that was my reaction. It was a great honor. It was an inspiration to see somebody so much at peace invite me into their beliefs because they cared about me as a human being. They cared about me and my soul. Second, if you're a minority in a majority context and you receive such an invitation, it might be scary. It could be intimidating. In both of these situations, I was a Christian in a Muslim majority context. And I think the same would be true the same for Muslims in America. If a Christian majority were to ask a Muslim minority to convert, it might be a little scary. It might be a little intimidating. What happens if I say no? Will they still respect my dignity to have a different belief? Even as I respect their responsibility to share that belief, especially among Christians and Muslims, there's a responsibility for Dakwah. And what about if the context is fragile? If you'll note, back in Pakistan, my friends wanted to make sure that I remained alive. There was the threat of violence. And I got to be very good friends with my guards that accompanied me from Peshawar down to Banu, near the tribal areas. It can be intimidating to be asked or invited to join another faith in a certain context, in a certain manner. It's totally normal and totally natural. My third principle is the principle of moderation. And that is simply this. If someone has the desire and the motivation to invite somebody else to change their belief, that desire is usually rooted in a view of the world where they have an exclusive view of truth, a truth that is objective, a truth that exists beyond our perception of it and the many perceptions of it. How do we think about that? Because that's not a moderate position, theologically. And the truth is, I'm not a moderate Christian, theologically. I believe that Jesus Christ is the way to heaven. That is my position. But what do I do with that? How do I think about that? And to hold an exclusive truth claim, and this is very important, does not mean that I'm an extremist. I can be an exclusivist without being an extremist. Christians, Muslims, and Jews will never agree about Isa al-Masih, as it says in Al-Quran Kareem, as it says about Jesus the Messiah in the Holy Quran. But can we have a conversation about those exclusive truth claims? I responded in both cases in Pakistan and Syria, said, I am honored by the invitation. I cannot change. But I would love to have a conversation with you about why you believe what you believe and why you want to invite me to change. Would you be open to that? Which then begs a question, the fourth question or fourth reflection is, what is my identity if I take my faith seriously and if I have an exclusivist truth claim? Can I understand truth the way I do and yet still believe that my faith commands me to love my neighbor as myself? Can my identity in an exclusive truth claim be rooted in a neighbor that does not believe as I do? And I think this is the fundamental question for many of us who have exclusive truth claims. Can we be theologically immoderate and, as a result, precisely politically moderate because we have an exclusive claim that issues an inclusive invitation. Fifth reflection from my experience with Dakwah in Pakistan and Syria. How do we come to understand living together? And for me, there's a fundamental question for policymakers, but also for practitioners. Is the goal integration or is it assimilation? For me, at least, assimilation means that the minority, ethnic group or religious group, has to believe and act and think like the majority. Integration, however, says we want you to bring the very best and essence of your identity to the table. Integration suggests that it's the responsibility of the majority ethnic religious group to provide the table and to protect and respect the right of non-majority religions and ethnic groups to have a seat at that table, to be included. So how do we live with this dignified difference that is theologically immoderate, but politically moderate as a result? So by way of summary, here's what I believe. I believe God has a plan, and that plan includes diversity, the presence of difference. But I also believe God wants us to engage that difference. As a Christian, I believe, and I think many of my Muslim friends believe, they honor God when they allow folks to think however they want to and have the freedom to change. Even as my Muslim friends hope that I become a Muslim, and my Christian friends, I hope my Muslim friends will become Christians. But I leave that to God. So in other words, I'm not moderate theologically and therefore moderate politically, and therefore in a position to agree to disagree agreeably about theology. And I think this is the resources from within our traditions that have to be brought to the fore if we are to solve the crisis of citizenship. Now, this is very ethereal, perhaps, and let me return to the practitioner perspective. And what does this look like? I want to give you some examples from America and Pakistan and Uzbekistan in closing. But first, I should ask, from your own tradition, as it were, what does this idea taste like? I think we are talking about the way of gado gado. That is what we're talking about here. Do we think that each ingredient should surrender its identity, the essence of its identity, in order to produce a bland tasting meal? No, of course not. Each ingredient is immoderate in its identity, unique identity, while being moderate in the inclusion to produce something greater. Gado Gado teaches us that there is unity in diversity. So what does the Gado Gado way look like in other contexts outside of Indonesia, at least in my experience? Here's an example from Washington, D.C. I had the privilege of co-founding something called the International Religious Freedom Roundtable many years ago. And it has inspired government ministerials, and just 2 weeks ago, another summit in Washington organized by civil society. The beautiful part about this example is that the people up there speaking on that particular panel, they are all American citizens speaking in their capital. The bottom up is having a conversation in the top down of government. And among those people are men and women, Catholic and Protestant, as you might expect in a Christian majority country, but also Sunni and Shia. There's also Baha'i. There's also secular atheist. And there's even a Scientologist in that picture. We don't agree on anything theologically, except that we have a right to gather as citizens. Nobody sacrifices their theology, and that's the rules to be at the table. But you have to be politically inclusive or moderate to participate. So the key to building such a context where faith can be lived out and the commands of the faith applied are twofold. One, there has to be trust. People of different faiths have to keep their word. Absolutely critical, or it doesn't work. Lies will sink every ship every time. The other thing is there has to be transparency, and this is particularly within a tradition. Believers of one faith must say the same thing privately to their fellow believers as they say publicly to non-believers. If this is violated, then there's no hope for a solidarity of a unity that results from diversity, of an inclusion that results from an exclusive truth claim. Two other places where I've seen this practice. In Pakistan, we did a conference on lessons we could learn from each other, Islam, Muslims, and Christians. And the night before, the chief minister of the province in Peshawar invited everybody to the table. There was Catholic and Protestant, Sunni and Shia, even Ismaili. But he also invited the Hindu and the Sikh. And the next day, the Hindu and the Sikh came up to me and apologized as a conference convener and said, "We're very sorry for taking twice our podium time." I said, as a typical Westerner and ignorant, I said, "Don't worry about it. It's just a conference." And their response was, "No, it's not. This is the first time that we have been able to have a seat at the table and express the values of our belief system as fellow Pakistani citizens, such that the values of our beliefs contribute to the well-being of all Pakistanis." We were also able to practice this and develop this in Uzbekistan. It's another story for another time, but we were able to bring 40 Americans, pastors, imams, and rabbis to Uzbekistan to meet rabbis, pastors, and imams there. And we went to the tomb of Imam al-Bukhari, who of course collected the sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the ahadith. And we learned about our irreconcilable theological differences, as well as our common values that enable political moderation. And we had fun. What you see here are pastors, rabbis, and imams talking about common challenges that face their city. How do they serve the city that they live in? How do they be good citizens together? And we had a lot of fun laughing. So let me conclude with one more slide, and forgive me for perhaps some self-promotion, but I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, and we've got a book coming out at the end of the month, end of the year. 30 different chapters from different regions and religions around the world about the skills and competencies of engaging the other, of remaining theologically immoderate in our relationship to God and holding an exclusive truth, and therefore politically moderate and issuing an inclusive invitation for everybody to have a seat at the table. It's a wonderful set of scholars and practitioners who share these views about how to engage one another without sacrificing your identity. Thank you for your time.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, this will be a more enjoyable occasion if we are to meet in person, but nevertheless, it's still, yeah, I'm happy to see familiar faces here as speakers as well as among the attendees. So my presentation today focuses on the central topic of this conference, which is moderate Islam, relating it to the current context in current political context in Indonesia. So this notion is not something new at all, but it has developed through Indonesian history, especially what I would like to say is the context after the 1998 democratizations. Well, I need to put it upfront. I'm critical of the notion, but I take this notion seriously, understanding it as a form of religious governance. And so I will start with the context and then look at what this notion does today, but also its pitfalls. Well, Pak Bob mentioned in his presentation that Indonesia has example lessons on the issues of equal citizenships in the context of accommodations of religion. So in the end, I would like to ask what example Indonesia would give with this idea of Islamic moderation. So I will share my screen, and probably following Pak Bob, I will use both Indonesian and English. Yeah, okay. So the first context, I want to start with the context. Moderate Islam is not a new term at all in Indonesia. It has developed in different contexts. It is more prominent since year 2000. Well, probably as a form of formal government policy. We heard about it in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 2002, it established a public diplomacy directorate, and one of the its main strategy is what it calls as empowering the moderate, and that means promoting moderate Islam. So and during the time of the former president Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, this notion of moderate Islam or empowering the moderate has been mentioned a lot. Now the context today, well, in the current government of Jokowi since 2014 after Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono is rather different, I think, and partly it owes to the more prominence given to this notion of moderasi beragama, or I translate it as religious moderation. It was initiated by the former Minister of Religious Affairs, Lukman Hakim Saifuddin, who was known as sympathetic toward religious minorities. A month actually before, well, this notion of moderasi beragama has been cooked in his ministry for some time, but it was only a month before he stepped down, a month before the new cabinet, the current cabinet. This book, Moderasi Beragama, was published. And more importantly, this notion of moderasi beragama or religious moderation, it is adopted in the RPJMN, the National Medium Term Development Plan, which means it becomes an official government program. It got lots of funding. And I think, well, in Walisongo, where we have this conference now, It is also has been discussed a lot, as well as in many other Islamic universities, but also in other non-Islamic institutions. So, what is religious moderation, as described in both the document of the RPJMN as well as in the book? Well, it is mentioned in the National Midterm Planning document. It is put as it is mentioned as a prerequisite of development. The strengthening of religious moderation to create religious and social harmony, and then to overcome intolerance. In the book of Moderasi Beragama, it's mentioned as the middle path, which is conceived as a position between the extreme right and left, the extremes of religious radicalism and liberalism. So liberalism is another extreme which it wants to avoid. So there is an acknowledgement that public religion is inevitable in Indonesia, and the government accommodates public religion, but in a sense, the form of religiosity should be moderate. And what is being moderate? Being moderate means it does not, it is not contrary to Indonesia's state ideology, Pancasila, etc., and civic values. It respects local cultures. It is tolerant of religious others. So a number of examples are mentioned. The book actually also has its own a kind of summary with many examples. So I think when we read the book, it's clear what it aims at. So religious moderation, all of this, tolerance, respecting cultures in line with civic values, they all sounds good. But if we look at it from the point of view of governance of religious diversity, is it a good governance? Here I'm critical of this notion for several reasons. First of all, religious moderation focuses on personal attitude. It pays less attention to the structural dimensions of the problems. What are the problems? Well, if we look at many research on Indonesian religious life, then we will see that the problems in terms of religious life is things like related to religious freedom, houses of worship, accusations of blasphemy, for example. These are some, of course, there's terrorism, etc., which is actually more a security issue. So I was thinking, how is religious moderation supposed to respond to this kind of issues, which I think now are important issues in terms of religion in Indonesia, such as defamation of religion or houses of worship. The answer, I think, it's clear, by nurturing a moderate religious attitude. So there is an assumption that if the people are moderate, then these issues will not arise. But part of the problem of the issues that we have actually, I think, are in the governance of religion itself, in the laws, some of the restrictive laws, which I will contend, actually they nurture intolerance. Well, if you accept this, then that means what is intolerant here is not the people, but the state. It's nurturing intolerance through certain laws. One of the best examples, I think, is the blasphemy law or the defamation of religion law, Undang-Undang Penodaan Agama. It's interesting if you see who usually love this law. It's not the moderate Muslims. NU, Muhammadiyah, they don't want to impose this law, persecuting people, accusing people of blasphemy, for example. But it is those who are not moderate or those who are conservative, the hardliners, they love this law, and they have been forcing the police to prosecute people based on accusations of blasphemy, for example. So this is state law. This is a formal law, and this is a law which I think is a good example of a law which actually nurtures intolerance and has been used by intolerant groups. So I think this kind of issues which the government have to deal with, and this is not dealt with in the notion of moderasi beragama. If you read the book, there is one part which mentions about this law, and that the law is potentially discriminative, etc. But then it simply says that, well, it's better to have a law than there is a vacuum of law. So there was no discussion about improving the law. How can we improve the formal religious governance so that it nurtures tolerance instead of intolerance? So this, I think, the notion of moderasi beragama lose sight of this issue. The issue of religious freedom, I mean, religious freedom is a notion which is probably, well, I think it's more strongly grounded in Indonesian constitution because we have it in the constitutions. We don't have moderasi beragama in the constitution, but religious freedom is mentioned in the constitution, but it's not mentioned even in the RPJMN. So there's less attentions to religious freedom, I think, and more on this notion of moderasi beragama, which I'm afraid it will distract us from the main issue. Another problem is, and this is a problem within the global politics of moderation, especially the global politics of moderate Islam. Who defines moderate? In Indonesian case, it says that the moderate is between the left and right extremes. Who defines the left extreme, the right extreme? Liberalism, for example, is mentioned as an excess in religion. So liberal Islam, I think that's also not acceptable. And if you look at the book, again and again, this contrast between left and right extremes, liberalism and radicalism, it's always mentioned again and again. So in the global politics of moderation, usually when people speak about moderate Islam, it tends to be liberal. But in Indonesia, it's not. It shouldn't be liberal. But who are the liberal and who are the radical? That is something which, well, sometimes I would say it's rather arbitrary. The main issue is I think, although it's not always mentioned, the focus is on countering radicalism, and everywhere this attempt to counter radicalism, it has its own pitfalls. The securitizations of religious governance, and then also the potential, the great potentials of falling into undemocratic actions, using this policy as a political tool to win, to gain victory in the competitions with rival Islamist political groups. And we know real well that especially the current government, Jokowi government, it has oppositions, very strong oppositions a few years ago from this rival Islamist political groups. And then it also acted repressively, banning organizations, which organizations like HTI and later FPI, Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, Front Pembela Indonesia, many people like this move. It's regarded as a move toward a more tolerant Indonesia. But the worry is that this is done in undemocratic means. It is done by imposing more restrictions, more repressions. So how to avoid the pitfalls? This is, I think, my last slides. Well, I would say in being critical to the notions of religious moderations, it doesn't mean that I don't like moderate people. I love them. And I believe the problem of intolerance is real, the violations of religious freedom is real, radicalism is real, terrorism is real. I don't deny them. But my question is whether this notion of religious moderation is the answer to the problem, or even part of the answer, or does it distract from the main problems by not putting upfront more important notions such as freedom of religion? What can be done as part of religious governance? It should be still put within the central notions of the constitutions, freedom of religion as part of human rights. And then also it should not distract from the state's responsibility to reform itself, especially in terms of the restrictive laws which I mentioned, which basically nurture intolerance. And then not to forget that all that the government does, it should be within the democratic framework, because otherwise it will return us back to the pre-reformasi kerukunan or harmony, which was, it was harmonious, but it was founded, this notion of harmony was founded on authoritarianism, not on democracy. We are in a democratic phase in Indonesia, and I think that is the main constraint for any policy. So the notion of, I mentioned earlier that it has been part of the global politics of moderate Islam. Of course, the Indonesian version in the context of majority Muslim society, it's different. But how should we develop this, or where should we position this? So to go back to Pak Bob's questions, I mean, he asked about the lessons that Indonesia can offer to the world. I think it's not simply to have a kind of moderate Islam, but also a very important context here is relates to the issue of democracy, to the issue of freedom of religion, which I think, unfortunately, it is not a central part of the notion of the religious moderation. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm still here. Yes. Do you want me to respond right away? Yeah, happy to do that. My quick answer would be that I think actually that the study of religion departments are quite successful and struggle with issues that are not different in the United States for programs in the study of religion, that we justify our existence in private institutions, whether they're confessional, that is religious institutions of higher learning, or non-confessional, whether they're state or private. So the challenges are quite similar. My sense, though, is that the difficulty comes, at least that's the point I want to make, comes from the fact that the success that we have with our with our programs of study often comes from the fact that we justify it by saying that we encourage human sympathy, that we're encouraging cultural wisdom and all the skills that come with that. Right? So that the idea of promotion of harmony and tolerance is key to our disciplinary self-understanding. And the larger point that I wanted to make is that can, if, and often it is, all too uncritically adopted, our stance, that it can actually continue to promote exclusion, certain forms of dominance, for which then the religion category, if uncritically used, stands in, whether that's on the basis of gender, race, economic class, ethnicity, you name it. So overall, I think, no, there is no shadow of an exclusive curriculum. I think it's a almost global phenomenon that our study of religion at universities still suffers from too uncritically adopting the idea that religion is simply out there and can be studied uncritically. So that will be my quick response. Yeah, I'll make that very quick in the response as well. I would respond similarly, that we do really well, and Indonesia, the Studi Agama programs do really well in doing all of these, promoting all of these skills that come with a form of empathetic imagination, service orientation, and openness, even a critical form of tolerance of otherness. But again, I don't think that always goes far enough. That we still, by not critically investigating what happens when something is being called religion and when people act by calling something religion, assign the religion status to something, if we don't investigate these processes carefully enough, then I think we can do disservice to our stated goals of harmony and tolerance, because we can still promote unequal structures of power. Quick example with Native American traditions here in the United States, that Native Americans themselves, but also that outsiders to Native American traditions say that Native Americans have religion is a very recent phenomenon, historically speaking. And it is one that has helped Native Americans to defend some of their traditions. But because we use the term often uncritically, especially in our textbooks, when we speak of Native American traditions, we're in a sense making Native cultural traditions still, even though we call it now religion, we're making it, we're measuring it against a template of religion that makes Native Americans still puts them at a disadvantage in protecting their cultural traditions. We see it particularly in claims over sovereignty of land, for instance. The concept of religion, the dominant one, doesn't allow for any claims to, at least not easily, to land. We see this in US Supreme Court cases quite vividly. So Native Americans can also be disadvantaged, right, when their traditions are presented in the form of religion. And when we do that or adopt that uncritically, then we hide these consequences that can lead to further or can continue injustices. And so that's where I think our study of religion still has a way to go, both in Indonesia and in the US as well.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very important question, but it's actually two questions. The first question has to do with what various da'i and mubalek whether their overall effect in Indonesia is to sustain and create and deepen tolerance. And the second question is, well, what should be the relationship between the states and the various LSM and ormas, organisasi massa that like NU and Nahdlatul Ulama, what should be the state's relationship to these organizations and others that are involved in Dakwah? So those are two very different questions. And they're questions, saya mungkin jawab dari segi seseorang sosiolog, ya. Jadi dan saya akan pinjam dari penelitian yang diselenggarakan belakangan ini, jadi selama 3 tahun terakhir ini oleh PPIM Jakarta. Jadi universitas yang universitas Bapak yang tanya itu tadi. Hasil dari studi PPIM selama 3 tahun terakhir ini sedikit mengagetkan saya pun. Bahkan saya sempat hadir 2 tahun yang lalu pada satu konferensi di PPIM tentang hasil dari riset mereka yang menunjukkan bahwa walaupun menurut saya kurikulum UIN dan IAIN tentang moderasi agama, tentang pendidikan agama, pendidikan kewarganegaraan itu menurut saya jelas ada kekurangan, tapi kalau dibandingkan dengan kurikulum seperti itu di negara saya, lebih baik kurikulum di Indonesia. Bagus sekali. Nah, tapi hasil dari riset yang diselenggarakan PPIM, Pusat Penelitian Islam dan Masyarakat di Sunan Kalijogo, Hidayatullah di Ciputat itu, menunjukkan bahwa sebetulnya bahkan sebagian yang cukup besar dari guru agama yang diantaranya cukup banyak diantaranya ada lulusan dari UIN dan IAIN sebetulnya tidak sama sekali menjalankan secara praktis dan real nilai-nilai itu. Jadi bukan kontradiksi, tapi jadi ada semacam ketegangan antara kurikulum yang menurut saya, dan saya telah meneliti dan membaca dan betul-betul menganggap bahwa program kurikulum ini yang diciptakan di situ, di UIN dan IAIN, itu lebih bagus daripada yang saya sempat amati di Amerika Serikat. Ini yang perlu di Amerika menurut saya. Nah, tapi di lain pihak sekali lagi hasil itu tidak cukup untuk memberikan sebuah sumbangan yang betul-betul signifikatif, betul-betul besar. Yang berarti apa? Yang berarti bahwa ada interaksi antara alumni program itu dan masyarakat sosial, dunia luar. Yang bukan kekurangan kurikulum itu, tapi sekali lagi kita yang mengamati dan yang belajar hubungan antara perguruan tinggi dan masyarakat, kita tahu bahwa sebetulnya seringkali kurikulum itu dampaknya jauh lebih kecil daripada dampak dari kegiatan sosial yang dijalankan setelah lulus. Dan itu yang kita lihat menurut saya dari pendidikan agama. Jadi itu saja. Nah, kalau yang kedua saya lebih singkat, ya sangat singkat, tentang peranan pemerintah. Menurut saya, walaupun menurut saya Depak menjalankan program yang baik, walaupun saya setuju dengan sangat setuju bahkan dengan teman dan mitra saya Pak Zainal Abidin Bakir, kami selama lama kerjasama, saudara pun tidak hanya mitra. Nah, saya sangat setuju dengan perspektif Pak Zainal, tapi saya juga menegaskan bahwa secara global, menurut saya kalau saya membandingkan Depak sekarang dengan 15 atau 20 tahun yang lalu, ada kemajuan yang luar biasa. 20 tahun yang lalu sudah baik,
Tapi tantangan dari masyarakat dari Indonesia, masyarakat Indonesia pun masih sedemikian besar. Jadi ya pasti masih ada kelemahan, mungkin tidak sebesar yang saya amati di Amerika Serikat belakangan ini, tapi tentu saja di sebuah negara demokrat selalu ada kekurangan. Jadi itu saja. Menurut saya program yang dijalankan yang diharapkan masih dalam bentuk aspirasi sangat bagus, tentu saja bisa diperbaiki. Tentu saja di antaranya perbaikan yang diharapkan adalah sebuah refleksi kembali terhadap definisi dan aplikasi gagasan agama itu tadi, yang seperti ditegaskan Pak Zainal. Cukup gitu, maaf.
Bapak Profesor Dr. Andi M. Faisal Bakti dari Kementerian Agama Jakarta. Terima kasih banyak atas kehadirannya, Bapak.
Ya. Makasih. Dari UIN Jakarta, ya. Oke, makasih ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih Bu Moderator, terima kasih Pak Ilyas Penah, Dekan Fakultas Dakwah Komunikasi UIN Walisongo, dan terima kasih apresiasi yang luar biasa kepada Bapak Florian Pohel, Bapak Chris Seipel, dan tentu Pak Bob Hefner, kawan saya ya, hampir 20 tahun lalu kita sama-sama di berbagai forum, pertama di Hawaii terakhir mungkin ya, kemudian ketika Pak Bob ke Jakarta ya tentu kita temu, dan tentu karib Pak Zainal Abidin Bakir ya, serta kepada seluruh penyimak acara diskusi moderate Islam promoting tolerance and harmony in the digital era. Mungkin komen pertama sekali yang sangat umum, kelihatannya digital era ini tidak dibahas oleh ketiga pembicara kita ini. Padahal mungkin penitia sangat menginginkan itu perkembangan mutakhir yang dibahas di digital era tentang hal ini. Karena kalau yang tertulis, itu seperti yang disampaikan tadi, barangkali sudah sebagian mafhum ya. Tapi yang ingin sekali kita ketahui ini 2 tahun terakhir tentang hal ini. Karena kelihatannya sangat seru di Indonesia, ya, karena memang yang namanya harmoni dan digital ini, sosial media ini sangat seru ya, itu sangat mudah kita akses sekarang ini, sehingga melahirkan permasalahan-permasalahan dan sekaligus juga mungkin harapan-harapan. Oke, this is the general perspective, general observation of myself about this conference and the speakers. The second one is to individual speaker, maybe briefly. I would probably talk by combining Indonesian model of questioning in the seminar and Western, particularly American model. Indonesian usually tend to give comment and then we don't know actually the answer. But the speaker should be able to understand the meaning of the comments. But the American system, like the one our moderator already read, this one is basically American system that we just go directly to the question. And the answer also will be very brief. Okay, to Dr. Florian Paul, thank you very much for your observation about this pendidikan agama menjadi studi agama-agama. I think this is really very important for us to understand why actually this change happened. Yeah, my observation, yeah, is that since Islam actually is very much responsive to any universal values, any idealistic values that raised among intellectuals would be found out actually in the Quran and in the Hadith. So it is very possible that we can always react to the good ideas coming from anywhere. Yeah. So including the issue of this pendidikan agama to studi agama-agama, because if you pendidikan atau perbandingan agama, sometimes is only emphasizing that Islam is the best one, while if you emphasize the studi agama-agama, you will see the values of this religious adherence, religious teachings. Okay, second one to our friend Bob Hefner. Yeah, I think also because of the universalism of Islam or universality of Islam. Yeah, why? So people would always react. Same actually comment to the first one, but I would emphasize the ideas specifically. Today, for example, moderate Islam, tolerance Islam, harmony in Islam, yeah, all these actually are basically Islamic values, including, of course, democracy, peace, and human rights, etc., etc. We can always found these ideas very well versed in the Quran, and of course, some traditional teachers probably who have not read these new ideas, of course, will be offended to these new ideas. But eventually, if you emphasize that the Quran actually says the hadith, many hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad actually mention this, eventually. So this is actually why the intellectualization, as you mentioned, very much alive in Indonesia because of this. However, the question about Islamophobia, Dr. Hefner, you mentioned already about Rohingya, you mentioned about India, yeah, in fact, also in the United States and also European countries, they are not very much tolerant, they are not very understanding about the culture of Islam, the teaching of Islam, which is actually very open, very universal. So I agree with you that actually it's quite the same, yeah, between the discussion in the West and also the bad reaction of the West to the Islamic community, yeah, rising in the West, as the case of Indonesian Islam against, let's say, to the non-Muslims. Okay, the next one is to Chris, Dr. Chris Saif. I think because you didn't mention about why these people coming to you, appreciating your conferences or talks after speaking to the public, but I have the feeling that probably also because of the universality or the universalism of your talk. Yeah, maybe you mentioned that these ideas we share, we let's say democracy, tolerance, respecting others. Of course, in the Quran again, yeah, it is widely and hugely, largely emphasized. A lot of verses, and then we can actually very easily mention without looking at the text of the Quran and the text of the Hadith, because we memorize this from the pesantren. So that's why they came to you, respecting you. Why they asked you to convert to Islam? Because for them, all you have said is basically Islamic. So you are actually Muslim. Yeah, you are actually basically practicing Islamic values. So because in Islam, if you talk about rukun iman, the pillar of belief in Islam, once you talk about God, of course, everybody believes in God, probably including many American people, probably atheists also, when they have problem and they say, my God, yeah. And every day they say, my God, or at least they say, my gosh, yeah. Yeah, but once you talk about general values, of course, we all share the same thing. And this is what we call rukun iman. We believe in God, believe in power, of, let's say, angels, believe in hereafter, believe in the religious revelations, let's say holy scripts, we believe in, maybe this is a little bit problematic, I believe in predestination, although in Islam also there are two opinions about this predestination. But we all share the same values about prophet, about messengers. We believe in Islam there are 124,303 prophets and messenger of God. So everywhere, probably in America, we can have a lot of prophets in the United States or in North America in general. Okay, so the principle of gado-gado, as you mentioned, I think it's really true, it's really correct in the sense that we all have our own taste, and then in Islam, of course, very much emphasize about this. I think we can quote a lot of hadith, a lot of Quranic verses about this. Okay, the last one. I think your moderator is very much, I know you are a little bit worried about time, but the last one to our colleague, Professor Zainal Abidin Bakir, probably you are brother of my colleague, Bakir. I think it's really right what you mentioned, that intolerance is not in the people, but actually in the society, in the state. I think I fully agree with this, because in the public level, we are respecting to each other, but sometimes by the rule and then about blasphemy coming actually from the top. But there is something very interesting yesterday about the days of Baha'ism, where the Ministry of Religious Affairs, congratulates the anniversary of this Baha'ism in Indonesia, which is not yet acknowledged. Even many people actually do not know what is this Baha'ism, but because of this, probably people are trying now to understand what is this, because it's widely discussed in social media for the last 2 days. Thank you, Ibu Moderator, for your patience. And this is the end of my talk. Sorry if there's something wrong with me, my talk. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Aku masih lupa.
Win Jakarta ada. Ya.
Well, saya mau mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Pak Andi Faisal Bakti itu untuk komentar yang sangat jelas, sangat jernih, dan sangat indah. Sangat indah. Menurut saya komentar itu yang dan gaya pikiran yang disampaikan Pak Andi itu mencerminkan sesuatu yang saya temukan seringkali di Indonesia yang selalu sangat mengesankan, yaitu bahwa Pak Andi itu tadi melihat ke dalam dan melihat universalisme yang dimiliki tidak hanya satu masyarakat, satu umat agama, tapi banyak, kalau tidak semua, tapi banyak umat dan negara bangsa. Saya selesai dengan satu observasi. Saya dilahirkan Katolik, saya masih menganggapkan diri orang Katolik yang sedikit nakal karena sedikit terlalu saya diajari lagi tentang agama dan keyakinan oleh siapa? Oleh orang Muslim Indonesia. Oleh orang Muslim Indonesia. Dan dari situ saya mengalami sesuatu yang mirip saya harap, dengan apa yang disampaikan Pak Andi itu tadi. Yaitu bahwa kita di Indonesia, saya diajak melihat, melampaui kebangsaan, keagamaan saya sendiri tanpa meninggalkannya. Tapi untuk melihat bahwa kita sebagai sebuah manusia, sebuah umat manusia, sebagai ciptaan Tuhan Allah, memiliki citra, fitrah yang sama. Nah, this is what I was taught in Indonesia, and this is what I heard in Pak Andi's presentation, and for that, I thank you. It is another example of the beauty that is Islam, and the beautiful Islam that is taught and promoted by not just moderate Islam, but the beautiful Islam that is promoted by the Department of Religion. And I thank you for that.
Welcome, Prof. Bob. Mudah-mudahan segera sembuh itu kepalanya.
So Dr. Sepo, this is a question from Walisongo Semarang from Ibu Aini. What do you think about the phenomenon of religion in the current digital era regarding diversity, which causes divisions, even a decrease in tolerance and deformation of a network of radicalism, which was originally incorporated in the internet and then influenced by radical ideas? So the time is yours to Dr. Sepo.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you to Pak Andi for his comments about the universalism of the faiths. I want to respond to the question and the commentary of Dr. Andi Faisal Bhakti by making a comment on the first two questions. Because I think Florian is onto something very important here. And I would say it goes a little bit deeper. As I understood what he was saying is the concepts that we teach are actually advancing marginalization and polarization, which I would agree with. I am not an expert on comparative religion, but I taught in that department at the University of Washington. And to put it a little too bluntly, comparative religion is a Cold War degree program that is dying quickly because it is not innovated and it is not developed. So the concepts are there, but nobody's coming anymore. So what's the innovation in the curriculum that brings people so that they want to be relevant? A colleague of mine there at the University of Washington, Jim Wellman, taught a class called A Life Worth Living. And he had 110 people sign up for the class, which is unheard of for a comparative religion. So here's my point. And this is why young people go to the digital age. People out there are yearning for meaning. They're yearning to understand the faith of their parents. They don't feel like they have permission to be orthodox, lowercase o, a traditional understanding of a tradition, and they're being bombarded by all these ideas. So where do they go to process that? Where do they have that conversation? And then the social media becomes a substitute for relationship and for critical thinking. This is the problem. The other piece about this, without the innovation in the curriculum that can be relevant to the students and draw them in to seek relationships that are rooted in their own faith tradition, is this second idea that comes from Bob's first answer. And let me say it differently. The problem with religion and politics is that when you mix them, you always get politics. And then you lose the capacity of religious leaders to be priests and prophets in their society. In the Christian tradition, the prophet was not so much about foretelling the future, but exhorting people to live the commands of the faith, to be truthful, to be transparent, to be honest, to be good citizens, to be in a right and righteous relationship with God and with neighbor. We lose that when we don't have a curriculum that attracts students to be in relationship with one another in the subject matter, because we're teaching in a Cold War way about Cold War boxes, Cold War issues, 25, 30 years after the end of the war. We need to be able to talk about what is relevant now to young people and what's affecting them and how they're being bombarded and having their values assaulted. And we can't give simple, superficial answers. And this is why it's so important to say, yes, there's universalism, but there's also difference. And to understand the differences that are irreconcilable between the traditions and root our response to the neighbor in them. Because at the end of the day, only good theology defeats bad theology. And when you mix it with politicians or with academics who don't want to innovate, you get bad answers where students are forced to go to social media for worse answers. And so we have a responsibility as teachers to encourage the open mind and the freedom of conscience to explore and yearn and discuss and write about what meaning is as they grow up in a global world. It's not just about Indonesia, America, or anywhere else. It's all of us now. So we have a responsibility as teachers to bring those folks along. Otherwise, we lose them and they won't come back. And that's my greatest concern.
A global forum in which the discussion inside that forum is responsible, so there will be no hoax or blasphemy of any kind. Is that a good idea? What do you think, Dr. Rico?
Of course, that's what I think. But it has to be modeled by our politicians. Every country is struggling with the same thing. This mixture of religion and politics that yields a religious nationalism that and the religious nationalism is about the majority defined against the minority. So how do you have a responsible conversation about a theology of citizenship that you can go and love your neighbor and as neighbors serve your city together? And that's what's so interesting about some of these emerging patterns of pastors and imams and rabbis working together, because it's simply true that religious leaders have more credibility than politicians. Now, there are good politicians out there, of course, but this is a global phenomenon of religion being manipulated to validate the power of politicians and be against the minorities, which is to be against your own faith tradition. So we have to find new ways to do this. And I think this kind of forum is exactly what we need. And we need positive case studies. So this is why Bob's point about Indonesia is so important. Of course, there's challenges in Indonesia. Of course, there's issues. But it is a positive story of evolution, of transition toward democracy and greater responsibility among religious and political leaders. And that's why we need to talk about the best stories out there in Indonesia, in Uzbekistan, in Ghana, that give us hope. Because there's a lot of bad stories where we could be pessimists if we chose to be.